Fantastic
Welcome
panel here.
to the AI Policy Podcast,
We have
a podcast
Neil
by the
Chilson,
Wadhwani AI Center
first, the
at
head of AI Policy at the Abundance
I'm Gregory
Institute.
C. Allen.
Also,
And
the
I'm
former
Andrew Schwartz.
FTC
Join
chief
us as we dive into
technologist
the
during
world of AI
during
policy,
the first Trump
where we will
administration.
discuss the implications of this transformative
also,
technology
Frederick,
and what governments
the
around the
director
world
of the
are
Tech
doing
Policy Center at the Heritage Foundation, and Brandon Pugh, the director and a senior fellow for Cybersecurity and Emerging Threats at the R Street Institute. So thank you so much for being here with me. I'd love to just start with a few kind of high-level thoughts on the Trump administration's approach to AI. Just kind of keeping it, brief and high-level to start. What are some of your expectations? And we can dive more into the details as we go along today.
Sure. So really high level, we're not working off of a blank slate here. The Trump administration actually did some pretty substantive work on artificial intelligence policy at the federal level, including an executive order. And so that vision was one of optimism, one of a powerful tool that can be useful both to civil society, but also to government and to defense. And I think we'll see that much more now. So I expect a turn from the sort of skepticism about how this might affect society and much more towards an optimism, and more than that, a sort of necessity of keeping the lead in this technology vis-a-vis China.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you think about the early conversations that we had in the first Trump administration about AI. In the public consciousness, there was a lot of killer robots, there was a lot of Terminator, there was a lot of Skynet, and you almost don't hear that at all. And I think it's going to hew more towards sort of when the RNC opened, you saw the platform was very pro-crypto, very pro-space, very pro-AI. I think they're all part and parcel. It's this pro-innovation platform. I like to call it an affirmative agenda for these emerging technologies. That's what we are trying to, I don't speak for anybody, but on the conservative side, but myself and the Heritage Foundation, we're trying to engender an idea of these technologies as I said before, affirmative, as positive, as something that is going to work for the everyday American, something that is going to work for Western values, for American values, especially vis-a-vis the more autocratic, shall we say, CCP-oriented values that are, I would say, quickly achieving parity in some instances of AI progress. So we are presenting a vision, we think, as conservative, that's very to the moon, to Mars-esque, shall we say, and less regulatory constraints, no more deserts, but building cities that work for the every American. And when I say cities, I mean, the things that are AI-driven, technology-driven in a good way. And I also think that there's a prevailing ethos from the people that we've seen fill positions already that is more like cheaper, faster, more. So we're going to see less bespoke programs, no more lumbering, unique platforms. It's going to be let 1,000 Anderls bloom, let 1,000 Palantirs bloom, let 1,000 scale AIs bloom, and I think that's going to be sort of the prevailing narrative that you see from the administration going forward. Pro-innovation, pro-AI development, pro-AI progress.
Yeah, I share many of those points, and I think it's also important to keep in mind how this fits into the incoming administration's views on deregulation in general. I don't see AI being an exception for that, whether that be the Department of Government Efficiency or just the vow to, on one end, cut 10 regulations for every new one. AI, I don't see being an exception. And to Neil's point, we largely saw that with the 2019 executive order and the subsequent 2020 guidance. There was numerous parts in there that said, look, let's look for ways to make this easier, both in industry, let's streamline this, let's look for ways we can, cut red tape and really return to, an opportunity where we're actually very, encouraged by the promise that AI has. Rather than this pessimistic view, like, Karen was kind of alluding to that some held for a long time. Fortunately, we've gotten away from that a little bit in DC. It still exists, but naturally I am an optimist. And I will say that doesn't mean there's no room for guardrails. And I think under the first Trump administration, we saw that. There was, an opportunity to really, capitalize on the technology, but do so in a responsible way. And I think we'll largely return to that.
So when you're talking about a deregulatory agenda, an agenda that promotes this innovation, what does that mean more specifically for some of the regulations? So we have the Biden administration has issued an executive order recently, a national security memo. Do you think that that executive order would be, fully or partially repealed? And what are some other expectations for regulation?
So I don't know if we're going to keep doing
Well,
that.
I think whoever wants to jump in,
yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think they've telegraphed the idea that they are going to revoke the current Biden administration EO, but I think there are two things at issue here that they'll particularly focus on, and number one is the idea of making an environment that's permissive for open source models to flourish. So instead of having these overburdensome licensing or certification procedures, that's what this less regulation environment, in my mind at least, looks like, is have a world where a lot of these foundation models are open source, where even Vice President-elect telegraphed it himself. He said, open source is a hedge against censorship. We don't want to see what happened with Google's Gemini model, which, I used to work in Silicon Valley. We know that was red teamed. We know people were comfortable with the outputs, and we know that the outputs were very ahistorical. They were biased. They were inaccurate. And we don't want to see that happen over and over again if there's a regulatory moat built around Google that says Google is the only safe, builder of these AI models. So therefore, they're the only ones who can, now the rest of the technologies have to, and startups and new entrants have to build on top of foundation models like something that Gemini is going to give us. So I think what less regulation means is having a permissive environment for these open source models to flourish that can act as a hedge against censorship, so not letting these big tech companies be the only ones in control, and then not really having thresholds on, or just restrictions on the ability for individuals to compute. My friend James Poulos, a long time ago, testified in front of Congress and said, we need a Second Amendment for compute. Now I've seen that taken up on X, if you guys have been very online like myself. Now that's just starting to percolate among a lot of the people who kind of matter in these circles, because unlike 10 to the 26 flops, yes, we know that it's going to cost $100 million to train a model like that, and only some companies are capable of doing that. But in the end, I do think that becomes a slippery slope leading down to individual compute. And we don't want to put any limitations on that, because we want every American family, every American community to have access to those, to the ability to process and use compute, no matter what they're intending to do with it right now. And I'll save my screed on AI safety, but I do think it's kind of important and is going to matter in the next 4 years too.
Yeah, we can get to AI safety. Yeah.
So on the executive order, I think, it was part of the GOP platform to repeal it. I think it will be replaced. I think it wasn't a very regulatory executive order, because there are limits to what the president can do. What it did was set a lot of the administrative state into nerding harder about AI in their spheres. And so there was a lot of rulemakings, a lot of comment periods, a lot of reports that were written, and I think there's some that are ongoing. Maybe a lot of that is paused. There certainly was the provisions that use the Defense Production Act to require transparency reporting. I think those go away. I think they're probably unconstitutional, and I don't see a replace that comes back under a Trump executive order in this space. But I do think that, and the one other big emphasis change is that the Biden executive order, building on the AI Bill of Rights and some other things that the Biden administration did, really took this fairness, accountability, and transparency framework that kind of comes from the privacy space, and they brought it over to AI. And the executive order is full of that type of language that talks about algorithmic bias, and I think that just won't be the primary or even secondary emphasis of a Trump administration in an executive order. It will be focused much more on what can we do to enable this technology both in the commercial sector and in the government sector, and a lot of that means cutting back on restrictions on, say, government use of data, or exploring areas where federal preemption might make sense given the mass of state legislation that's happening right now.
Yeah, and I think one of the early concerns around the executive order was really the regulatory approach it was taking. I mean, matter of fact, the president in his remarks around that actually called for rigorous regulation. And I just think that is an approach and mentality we're not going to see under an incoming administration. You know, regulation is not the answer to our problems. Rather, the first Trump administration leaned on soft law, looking at standards and best practices and guardrails, rather than jumping into a very regulatory and enforcement-backed approach. And I'm not to say there's not some good in that. I know, I come from a cybersecurity background. There are beneficial aspects of that for security, and I think that gets to the point where a lot was thrown under the executive order, and that's how they kind of marketed it. But there are so many activities underneath that, and some of which actually started under the first administration. So the question will be is what does it replace with, how much carries over, even if it is in fact repealed, which, like Neil, I fully expect to happen. But to the second part of your question around the National Security Memorandum, I'm not sure how many read that or have been following that. In my opinion, actually, it took a much different approach. Maybe I'm pessimistic, but I saw the executive order as being, if anything, like hampering innovation. The NSM actually came out the opposite, saying, let's fully utilize the technology. If we don't, we're going to cede our leadership position in the world. There's going to be consequences to our defense base by the same administration, which is very interesting. And I think, though, there's actually more risk on the defense side, because I would hate to see a scenario where we either prohibit an application or deem it high risk, subject to a lot of oversight, unfairly, realizing that our adversaries and competitors like China are not going to follow that. So I think it is incumbent on us, because we are a democracy, is to have guardrails, but we don't want to set ourselves up for failure, which I think, if we continue down the path we're going is a possibility.
And Kara, you brought up the AI Safety Institute. So what do you think about the future survival of that? I did note that Ted Cruz had alleged in a recent letter that the Europeans were trying to influence AI regulations in the U.S. and talked about that institute and as being the product of a radical left. But on the other hand, you have someone like Elon Musk, for example, who's backed a California bill that requires large-scale models to undergo safety testing. Where do you think some of the Trump administration perspectives on safety will come down?
Yeah, I think in terms of, I'm with Brendan when guardrails matter. And I don't think the Wild West hasn't worked out in other areas of the tech space, and I don't think it will necessarily work out with AI absent guardrails. So that's my caveat. And then I'll say, for good or for ill, I think the word AI safety has been poisoned. I think that it is radioactive in some very conservative circles. Which side wins the day, I don't know, because Elon has been very forward-leaning when it comes to potential existential risks, when it comes to AGI and whatnot. There was a time, and people will remember this, where we thought AGI was just wizardry and for the charlatans. But there are very serious people who do say it's right around the corner. And I think Elon Musk has been warning a lot of those potential dangers. So I do think we need to put some constraints. I like to say I'm not an open source absolutist, but more open source is typically better than less open source. So I think in the end, there's a big problem when it comes to using emerging technologies that the US government has faced, in part because of its own doing. And I know this because I used to work in the counterterrorism digital space, both in government and outside government, is we create these tools that are ostensibly for noble purposes, and then they're perverted and at times turned inward on the American people, especially when it comes to digital surveillance tools and whatnot. So we need to draw bright lines, I think, when we're talking about things like AI safety. Siloing things like this to pure national security remit, I think, would be very advantageous if the pro-AI safety people in the crowd want to see their agenda enacted. So it has to be constrained by pure national security implications, not made up, not expanded, not inflated, as we've seen in the counterterrorism sphere, where foreign Islamist terrorism became, domestic extremists became people who go to TLM mass and parents at school board meetings. So we need to be very, very careful when we talk about AI safety. I think it's a critical component of AI governance, but it has been poisoned. There's merit behind people who think it's been poisoned. And if you look at pure national security constraints in that bright line, you're going to go farther if you're pro-AI safety than not.
Yeah, as a quick follow-up, I think what Kara's getting at is that there's really no universal definition for this. What you view as AI safety may be much different than I. I mean, as a good example of that, I think, we've seen the AI Safety Institute do a lot of work around AI red teaming, and I think that has value to a smaller company that is just not sophisticated enough to walk through that themselves. On the other hand, we have seen them go down paths that are very different than what the average person would think of when we talk about AI safety. I think that's the challenge, is really how do we strike that balance? I think in fairness, NIST has done a lot of good work on the cybersecurity front as well, so I'd hate to see efforts like that done away with. But I don't think it's advantageous to continue down the path that we've done now. And I think that's the reason we've seen, notably, Senate Republicans express concerns around the AI Safety Institute. What's interesting, though, is that's not universal. We've also seen House Republicans, propose and continue bills that want to codify the AI Safety Institute. So it'll be interesting to see how that actually plays out next year. It's not crystal clear to me. I mean, I always have to check my phone, but we should be seeing the House AI Task Force report come out really any day now. If it's not out as we're speaking.
It's not last day.
Exactly. It's one of those things you have to always update X because it's DC timelines. But yeah.
On the role that NIST has played, I think it's been a great institute, and I think part of the risk of the AI Safety Institute has been politicizing overall NIST efforts, which are critical across a wide range of issues. And so I don't know exactly, the AI Safety Institute was created by the executive order, so if the executive order is repealed, that doesn't necessarily mean it goes away unless the Trump replaces and actually says that it needs to go away. But the safety debate is complicated because there's a wide range of, the terms are so broad, and the people who identify in different sectors, there's a big of existential risk, folks who worry that AI is going to kill us all. And that's a small but very loud minority. And that's sort of bled out into a lot of the policy space. And that's made it very complicated to actually have sophisticated conversations often. And so I do think that rhetoric was early into DC and sort of has faded, at least to Congress. But it's not going to stop coming. And so when I think about somebody like Elon Musk, who has some of those concerns, but is very much not a red tape kind of guy, it's interesting to think about how that will play out in AI policy specifically. There is some risk, I think, that the AI safety folks whose main goal is to slow down this technology worldwide until we can get enough control over it, as they might say, are going to pair sort of more with the AI ethics folks who believe that we need regulation to make sure that it's fair, et cetera, and it impacts society. Not because they really think that those are the important issues, but because they think that's a way to slow down the technology. And they might be right.
Mm-hmm. But you can also sort of shoot the gap, too, with technical remedies. So open sourcing, the open source community can help identify and really fix some of these potential malicious uses before they're deployed. So I think that could potentially be that balance and the solution to that balance as well, if we let open source technologies prevail.
Yeah, and I think it is also a matter, I think, of scaling back. Saying if the AI Safety Institute stays, I think they've taken on some aspects of their portfolio that should not continue. For instance, like on the national security side of the House, the NSM, the National Security Memorandum, gives, let's see if I'm right, I'm always hesitant to give exact stats in a panel, but let's say I think it's roughly 23 call-outs for the AI Safety Institute. And in my opinion, at least, for what that's worth, I don't think there's a large role for the AI Safety Institute to have oversight or involvement with national security-related activities. And that's what they've gotten in the National Security Memorandum. I don't want to overstate that. It's not every aspect of the NSM, but there are many aspects where a civilian agency is now coordinating and having an oversight role over DoD activities. I don't think that's appropriate.
I wanted to shift internationally, talk about China for a minute. There's obviously been a lot of concern about the country's access and development of artificial intelligence chips and work on the export control front. There are also concerns about China, potentially exploiting data in the United States. What do you see as kind of the most pressing concerns that the Trump administration would want to address? And, is there any, overlap or a lot of difference with the Biden administration?
So, I think the most important thing that the Trump administration will have to address is, right now the AI community is largely in a permissionless space, right? Like they can build products, they can bring them to market, they can test them in the market, and there isn't a big approval process that might slow things down, which some of the big companies could handle and some of the small companies would struggle, or open source companies would struggle with. I think the number one objective is to keep that engine going. Like the US is the leader in this space, both on the hardware and on the software side, and we really need to stay there. And I think that will be the primary goal. Now, there's lots of other things about how they do that. Some of them are, tariff-based or export control-based. Some of them might be, maybe it's government investment or infrastructure building or things like that. But I think primarily that's how we win. We don't beat China by, adopting a China-like approach to this technology, because the U.S. approach has been really, really, really successful so far. So I think we should lean into what we're good at, developing new things, investment, capital markets, and competition, and not try to hem it in, and make sure that we're not getting in our own way.
Yeah, that's not wrong, but what I'm sort of seeing in the undertones of that are the idea that we have a cohort of big tech companies right now that are actively working with the Chinese Communist Party. You look at Amazon, you look at Google, even General Dunford, way back in, 2017, he basically said any Google's work on AI in China is an indirect contribution to the PLA. Then he corrected himself, no, it's a direct contribution to the PLA. So I think, as one of my friends always says, US big tech companies are going to have to pick a flag. And it should be the stars and bars, and not China. And I do think that the Trump administration will wake a lot of these companies up to that. If you look at people who've contested the primes, like I'll invoke Anduril again, one of the big things that company did when it was coming on the scene well, at least when I heard of them in 2017, 2018, was that they had a big American flag on the masthead of a microsite when you were applying for jobs. So there was no equivocation when it came to what side that company was building for. So everyone's heard of American dynamism right now. Everyone probably sees the clips of Alex Karp talking at the Reagan Defense Forum, where he basically says, no, we think our enemies should be scared. And he builds defense technologies to scare our enemies, to restore some semblance of deterrence. So I think the Trump administration will take a hard line on China again, as they had in the first administration. And they'll also start to nudge these big tech firms to actually pick the American flag as their primary customer and pretty much stop their incursions into China, I can hope.
Yeah, no, and I hear what you're saying. I would say the only caveat to that would be is we need to really be setting up all of our companies, regardless of they're small or big, up for success. Because, it's not like what it was decades, this is not a contrary to you, it's not like what it was decades ago where it was usually the government being the innovator, government was generating our new technology, the military was leading on. It's the exact opposite. The government's doing a lot of good work in AI, but it's largely industry is leading here. We're largely adopting their technologies, or we're iterating from it. So I think we'll see the incoming administration really foster that type of environment, whether they're big tech or small tech, if you will. To your point specifically, though, I agree with what they're saying. You flag data. This is for anybody in the audience. I know I have friends here that know me. I'll never resist an opportunity to talk about data. We know, and I will connect it to AI. Don't worry. We know China's been collecting as much information on their own citizens, our allies, and Americans for, unfortunately, decades. And it's really all facets of life. The one concerning aspect of that is now how they're able to make sense and parse that data much quicker and much easier, leveraging AI. And I think regardless of what we do from a regulatory or legal standpoint in the US, they're going to do that regardless. So that's just a fact of the matter. We have to realize that. But we can leverage AI accordingly now to combat those uses, and perhaps make our uses of similar data that we hold even more efficient. So that is one potential fear I have with China, and I don't see that slowing down. And I do agree with Kara. The concerns with China are only going to increase, I think, under the new administration, and rightfully so. We have to take it at face value. The CCP has said by 2030 they want to be the world leader in AI, if not quicker. We can agree or disagree if that's actually a reality, but we should be planning accordingly and not losing our leadership position.
Since we're talking international, I'll expand it a little bit, but it's still a bank shot through China, which is Europe.
I was going to ask.
I do think that there's, at some point, and we heard some of this discussion on the campaign trail, that American companies who have been sort of subject to these specific rules in Europe, which are treating U.S. companies and U.S. shareholders as a piggy bank in many cases, by setting thresholds at which, and certain regulatory regimes that apply to just a very few large companies that are all based in the U.S. And then just below that gap are Chinese companies who are flooding, who are going into Europe to fill that gap. And so I think at some point the Trump administration is going to look and say, like, why is Europe kicking American companies in the teeth and letting Chinese companies in? And I think that will be a problem for Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And the Middle East too. I think that we can't ignore, or we can't talk about every corner of the world, but I think what we've seen with UAE, what we've seen with their ability to build and concentrate these data centers and their capabilities, I think that's something that we need to absolutely keep an eye on as well, because as we know, especially with a lot of the digital surveillance technologies, they're not exactly behaving as Western democracies would. Getting their hands on these technologies.
Mm-hmm.
Well, since the EU came up, I can't resist talking about that. I mean, EU AI Act could be its own panel. I know we have many friends from the EU here today. So I will say, I'm sure that works in the EU for many countries there. That the EU version of tech legislation is not traditionally the U.S. view. And I think that's concerning. I mean, we saw the EU really lead when it came to privacy with the GDPR, and by default, many U.S. companies have really followed that because it's a strict standard and we don't have a privacy law here. So I think that is the risk we see, is how many U.S. companies now go down that path, follow the EU AI Act, which, I know there's probably mixed feelings here. I tend to be more on the opposite side of it. I think there are some aspects of it that are decent, but there's just as many, if not more, that are concerning. So that's just something for us to grapple with in terms of what are countries around the world doing.
Mm-hmm.
As a former FTCer, I have to say, we in the U.S. actually have many privacy laws. We just don't have one overarching, comprehensive one.
100%. In that you're right. I mean, the number of sectoral privacy laws we have in this. I don't want to turn this into a privacy panel. We have many, and not to mention the number of states that have privacy laws. Good or bad, we don't have a GDPR like here.
I wanted to go back to the Middle East just for a moment. So there has been a debate over, issuing licenses to supply AI chips to the Middle East.
Have you done any work on this?
Yeah. Any thoughts about what direction that could go in? Partnerships in the Middle East, openness to trade there or lack thereof?
I mean, I think it's ambiguous. Again, knowing how these technologies have been exploited in the past, I do think there's a little bit of cause for concern there, but at the same time, resources, right? What do you need for good AI? You need a heck of a lot of compute, and they got it. You need a lot of resources, they got it. You need a high volume and variety of data, they're working on it. You need the ability to, and the physical structures to process it. And they can, I think, and I've heard this before, I'm not the first to say it, but they would desire to fill the entire desert filled with data centers if they could. So I definitely think that is going to be a sensitive relationship that the Trump administration will have to navigate. They've been fruitful partners in other aspects of international relations. You look at the Abraham Accords, that never would have worked without the partnership of Arab nations. So I do think as long as there's a healthy realism injected into potential partnerships, they could be lucrative, and they could potentially, again, create some sort of a bulwark against an ascendant China if China, who obviously wants to get in there first, doesn't make as prodigious an incursion as they're trying to at this point. We know that they've been very successful in Latin America, the Global South, in Africa right now. So I would like to see us co-opt as many what I call swing states, and sort of a mix between authoritarian and hybrid governance. We call India and Brazil more on this sideline, this scale, vice, the UAE and other Middle Eastern nations. But I would like to create as big a buffer between China and the West as possible, and some nations could help us do that.
we've sort of been talking in a sort of us versus them a little bit here, and I just want to say, take this opportunity to say that AI is a really powerful technology that can bring a lot of benefits, and those benefits should be widely felt around the world. And I think it shouldn't just be the U.S. that benefits from it. We should lead, because I think we can bring our values and our economic value to the world. But those technologies are powerful, and there's a lot of people around the world that could benefit from the health and transportation and safety aspects of it over time.
Okay. I'll go ahead and open it up for audience questions in just a minute. I did want to ask, you touched a bit on investment. We talked about, we've kind of been talking about government and private partnerships. In its most recent report, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Commission urged a Manhattan-style project in the U.S. to develop artificial general intelligence. I was curious what you think about that, or kind of other, big government approaches. Also in the Trump administration, I think the president-elect has, expressed some kind of skepticism of industrial policy. Does a big project like that, fit in that framework?
So, there's lots of ways to tackle this question. I'll just say I think AGI is overrated. Not that it isn't an amazing technology if it happens, but people sort of have this idea about AGI that not only is it sort of near, but then once that happens, we have this quick takeoff. We already have artificial superintelligence. It's called the economy. It's called cooperation. It's we as individuals, yes, we're intelligent, but us collectively are super intelligent. And what we can do in this space is pretty amazing. And when I think about how computers will fit into that ecosystem, I think there's assumption that it will somehow take over this complex system that we have. But I think largely that's because people overrate the value. Very smart people overrate the value of intelligence to getting things done in the world. And getting things done in the world is not primarily a factor of intelligence or individual intelligence. It's a factor of working together, cooperation, specialization, division of labor. Those are things that they don't scale with computer power. They scale through collaboration and institutions. And so, yes, our institutions will change a lot. Do we need a Manhattan Project to do that? I don't think so. We have tons of investment pouring into this space. Now, on the national security side, maybe there are some specific investments that need to happen. I'll leave that to the national security experts, but I don't think achieving AGI is the sort of thing that we need a Manhattan Project for.
Yeah, I think industry does have this well covered, and I think with the advent of what I'll call the new right tech, or the new tech right, we have industry leaders who bear a cognition of America first realism. We have people building safe superintelligence who have imbued within their technologies Western values. So in terms of a concerted effort to create AGI imbued with democratic values, I'm sort of assuming that is where we're going with that. I kind of think we have people in industry who are willing to do that now, which is exciting. It's amazing. There's not much of a schism between what's good for America and what's good for industry. Now we can sort of meld the two. It's very exciting to us. And I think going forward, Bob Work said, back in 2016, 2017, we had a Sputnik moment. And I think people have internalized that. Industry leaders have internalized that, along with defense leaders. And now we can finally marry those two cohorts and achieve something great without having to have that big Uncle Sam pocketbook dump. hopefully.
Yeah, I think there's room for both. I would say a select role for government, but a significantly broader role for industry. And I think just to kind of give you a concrete example of that with cybersecurity, we've seen specific federal agencies that have deep expertise in cybersecurity leaning into seeing how can we further innovate around AI and cybersecurity, how can we better defend ourselves as a nation, leveraging the technology. And they know their threats they're facing best. They know what the needs of their federal agencies. They know how to protect the United States. And we've seen that playing out, like U.S. Cyber Command is doing a great job on that front. But at the same time, we've seen incredible innovations at a much quicker speed coming from industry. I mean, you've named a few of them. I mean, looking at the work that Palantir has done is remarkable. Shift 5 by seeing if an attack on a weapon system is actually an attack versus an anomaly. And then even some of our larger tech companies have done tremendous work helping, fight both threats to AI infrastructure itself and then also threats leveraging AI. All using AI itself. I think that's really what's encouraging for me at night is how do we leverage the technology to actually make ourselves more secure. And I think it's possible. Industry is leading on that, and I think we need to get out of their way and actually let them do that.
Great. Any audience questions? We'll go here in the front.
Right behind you.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I see a big problem here that no one's dealing with. The world does not recognize that the People's Republic of China and North Korea will not respect any guardrails. I see the academics, I see the government, I see commentaries and thinkers sweating bullets coming up with guardrails. And I guarantee you, none of them will be respected by the Communist Party of China. So where's Plan B? Where in the State Department is Plan B? Where there are 10 guys worrying about what the world looks like when one or two countries respect no guardrails whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen that in biotechnologies like CRISPR, right? There's no scruples when it comes to what China will do. There's no scruples when it comes to them cutting out organs of live human beings to experiment on them. Yeah, we understand that. And I think Neil's answer is pretty revealing, and it holds true here, is we just have to out-innovate. We absolutely have to out-innovate and protect ourselves at the same time. So a mixture of offense and defense, at least in my mind. Obviously, there are other applications. When I think of open source technologies, a lot of the pushback I've gotten for saying open source is great, open source über alles, is the fact that, what if China, we know they're building on Llama, we know they're building on a lot of our open source models, but if we think that they're not going to have their own indigenous capability, we're kidding ourselves. If we think that our big tech companies are not infiltrated by CCP spies, we are absolutely kidding ourselves. They're already there. They've already extracted proprietary information from Google when it comes to building some of these AI models too. So we just have to build faster and we have to build better. I think that's basically the only answer because we're not going to protect ourselves from this rampant espionage. We're not, as my friend Josh Steinman says, we're not guarding these AI models and the proprietary information around them as if they were state secrets, because they potentially are. So I think we do have to take that a little bit more seriously, but also recognize that espionage is always going to be with us, as you know very well from your life, from the Chinese Communist Party, and we have to exist in that reality and keep going on offense at the same time.
I think you're 100% right, and this is the point I was trying to get to earlier. Is regardless of what we do from a policy or legislative standpoint here, China doesn't care. At the end of the day, they may publicly look like they care, like we see on privacy. Believe it or not, China has a privacy policy. They also have a data security policy. Whether they follow it or that's just to protect their own citizens from other governments, not their own, is a different story. And that's really the concern. We see China trying to get out there, win the messaging campaign, show that they are the world leader on technology, specifically AI, and that's always been my concern. Fortunately, most of Congress has walked back these broad calls for like a comprehensive AI measure here with a new agency and licensing. Really, all that's going to do is help countries like China. That's not going to help us. I think that's the risk. And there's a further subset. We need to be hypercritical. If we put out a new national security memorandum, or I should say the new incoming administration puts out a new one, making sure that balance is really clear. Because China leveraging AI in their defense and intelligence community, it's not going to have boundaries. That's not to say we shouldn't have some. I do think there are areas of AI that, perhaps as a United States and the values we uphold, we should be, having some guardrails, but it's a matter of getting that balance. I think recently we've not struck that balance. I'm hopeful the incoming administration is going to kind of get that balance right.
Can I add a little piece of to that call for getting the guardrails right? I mean, I think that the easiest way to break this down is just to say at what level in the stack are you regulating? All of these calls for comprehensive AI regulation, they're regulating at the model stack. And that is so abstract that it's hard to know exactly how to do it well. And when you see bills like SB 1047 that you referenced in California, what it basically said was just make promises that it's going to go okay, and then we'll sue you later if it doesn't. Because we don't really know how to set the standards. That's so abstract. The guardrails need to be at the use level, and that lets us be specific to the harms that happen. And it also lets us take into account, hey, making our cars safe to drive if they have AI technology in it, that doesn't make us weaker vis-a-vis China. But making all of our models have to pass some government checklist before they even get rolled out into applications, that does make us weaker vis-a-vis China. So I think we can identify the guardrails that are good for consumers and for markets and to deal with market failures, and the ones that would just put us back without a huge amount of benefit.
Okay, more questions? Let's go here in the middle. Thanks.
I am Emine Kaplan, and I am research scholar at American University. I am focused on the role of artificial intelligence in political propaganda during electoral process. So my question will be about that. As you know, in recent years, AI has been used in election campaigns, especially in the US, to spread disinformation which harms democracy. Do you think Trump will take any action to stop this? If yes, what steps will be taken during second Trump administration to prevent AI disinformation? Because if I'm not sure, but I think there is no regulation related to data-driven election campaign in US. Thank you.
So last year, very early on, after the release of ChatGPT, but then especially ramping up last year, there were tons of projects around AI, disinformation, and elections. We started a project at the Abundance Institute that tracked all the media coverage of all of these incidents. It was a big nothing burger, frankly. It didn't affect election outcomes in the US. And last year was a year of global elections as well. And while there were lots of incidents and lots of use of AI, the use of it, I like to say that the constraint in lying is not the ability to manufacture lies, it's the spreading of lies. And that's it's easy to manufacture lies. Millions of people do it online every day for free. And so the misinformation and disinformation, the incremental effect of AI, I think, was pretty small. And I think that played out pretty true in this set of elections. Now, will that always be the case? I don't know. We need to keep an eye on it. The US does not have restrictions on what you can say in campaigns for some very good reasons, known as the First Amendment primarily. And so that's the core of free speech, is political speech. And so the use of AI in that context, I think, is very difficult to regulate in the US. And I think that's generally to the better for the US.
Yeah, and this is, sorry, I don't know if you want to get next. Yeah, I will say this is very much an active question. I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, if I were to ask the room if anybody knows what CISA is, maybe 2 of you would have known. I will say maybe that it's not unanimous now, but I will say a lot of people know what CISA is, which is our cybersecurity agency in the US, largely because of their concern around their involvement in disinformation. That's what we've seen the incoming administration latch onto and be very critical of. And that's why we've actually seen some calls in the Senate, notably, just to completely disband that organization or move them to another federal agency. There's multiple reasons, but one of the key ones has been their alleged involvement in disinformation and coordination with tech companies as well. All that to say, I will say because of that skepticism, I'd be surprised if we would see a concerted effort to now bring that back. I know we've seen some calls to say, well, we should stand up an independent office that looks at disinformation like some of our friends around the world have done. I'm mostly with Neil. I think that is a very slippery slope to go down to once we start regulating speech. And because what is the purely domestic speech versus coming from a foreign adversary, it's hard to say. That is a very hard path to go down. I'd rather err on the side of free speech, personally.
Okay, let's go here. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I usually don't need one of these.
I think it's working fine. Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me now? It may take a little while for the executive orders to be rescinded and for something to come back in place. For those of us who are responsible for accelerating AI in the federal government in the non-national security, non-intelligence arena, what would be your advice? What should your marching orders? What should we focus on? What should we not focus on some more anymore when it comes to not only what we're doing inside of the agency, but nationally, and especially as we're providing technical assistance for G7, G20, those types of things. What will we do in the meantime? We're in a quagmire right now trying to figure that out, and we want to comply. Thank you.
That's a great question. I think, so the executive order is, like I said, a lot of it is sort of nerd harder, right? So like, just keep nerding on, I guess.
Everyone in that room.
And a lot of it's not particularly, a lot of it's not particularly prescriptive. Now it has an orientation, but I think you can continue to work hard to try to figure out like what are the barriers to adoption within your agency? Are they legal? Are they practical? Are they financial? And then help tackle those. And on the international frame, I know less about that. I'd be happy to talk to you and learn a lot after, but yeah, nerd harder.
I think you'll make your lives a lot easier if you haven't done this already by having data processing standards. We were big in the national security space advocates for open architecture with plug and play, commercially viable technologies wherever possible. Not just government off the shelf, but commercially off the shelf if you could. We even advocated when I was back in my old think tank for having a data processing scorecard and using that to evaluate your potential vendors so that you make, when you onboard, you make it much smoother. This is how we process data. This is how we label data, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those small tweaks, if you haven't done them already, could go a long way in preparing yourself for a future that's going to be more, cheaper, faster, better.
Yeah, maybe slightly pessimistic word in AI then. I ultimately see AI as just a form of technology. I think it does have unique considerations that we don't see in other forms of technology. But with that said, some of the concerns or some of the implications already addressed by existing policy and law. So a lot of people, when I say, what are you actually concerned with? And we drill down into it. Sometimes it goes back to a data or a privacy or security. I'm like, well, all those are addressed in other forms of technology. Not saying that there's not uniqueness to AI, there is. But we're not starting from scratch. Like we as a government, we're used to handling a lot of data, sometimes better than others, depending on the agency. But that's not inherent to AI. So all that to say is, even if the AI executive order was rescinded on day one, and there was nothing that replaced it for months, I don't think we're in this like a chaos situation. We should go back to how we've been leveraging and addressing some of these concerns for well over a decade.
Okay, and here in the front.
Thank you all so much. Kelsey Frierson with Beacon Global Strategies. I'm curious to hear, kind of building a little bit off of the mention of G7 and G20, how you envision the second Trump administration engaging in an international forum around AI and around AI infrastructure. Do you see a strong presence at some of the big international institutions? Do you see a focus on more of the mini-lateral, kind of direct bilateral, or one or two or three countries in a group focusing on a specific issue? How do you see the Trump administration engaging on these issues on the international stage?
Well, I would hope that a lot of this focus is, let me say what you won't see. You won't see big international agreements that will tie American companies' hands. I think that's just not going to happen from this administration. And And I think that what I would hope to see is that we look at some of the other policy areas where we're dealing, say, with international cross-border data flows, for example, that are making doing this type of business and providing these types of services more difficult. And so I could see, for example, some negotiations between the US and Europe, with Europe trying to get some of these technologies deployed, maybe even with some of the member states who have innovative companies wanting to make sure that those companies can sell into the US market under the EU laws. And there will be some opportunities for negotiations like that to help grease the skids of international commerce.
And I think there are some fora that the incoming administration can't afford to ignore, like international standards bodies. Back in 2019, China had, I think it was over 90% of AI-driven facial recognition technology standard patents. And we know, as facial recognition technologies have been proliferating all over the world, and sensor proliferation in general, and the ability, as Brendan said before, to parse through that data now with artificial intelligence and have it have value and make sense of it. And lest we forget the OPM hack, the Marriott hack, the Anthem hack, the Equifax hack, Salt Typhoon, which is still ongoing. How is this not a bigger story? Yep. TikTok, as we speak. So all of these reams of seemingly disparate data sets are being exploited, as we used to say in the intelligence community, exploited, processed, and used for ill against us. So I think we need to get involved in those standards bodies and have some say in how the designs of technologies are dictated throughout the world, how technology is deployed and used throughout the world. We don't want, this is another plug for open source, we don't want LLMs to proliferate around the world that have to imbue core socialist values and have the rest of companies build on those, because we know the generative AI rules in China were finalized, and that is a stricture. So let's build and design products that the rest of the world wants to use, and let's not hamper ourselves by having some say in how they are used in these international fora. So I think standards bodies are really critical, and I'd like to see more US involvement in them as well.
Yeah, just being mindful of time. I think there's room for select engagement. I was fortunate to be one of the US representatives to a G7 convening about 2 months ago, specific to cybersecurity and regulatory harmonization. Super interesting. The goal was there's a massive patchwork around how we address cybersecurity, and AI is a critical component of that. I will say, it's good to be part of those conversations. I think at the end of the day, a U.S. mentality is sometimes different than a lot of our friends around the world. At the end of the day, there were some EU countries represented that have, national ways to address cybersecurity incidents. We do not have a counterpart to that here. So getting harmonization is sometimes hard when we're just starting in completely different sides of the spectrum for right reasons. So all that to say is I'm encouraged by those conversations. I think the outcome of harmonization could be good. Getting to an actual result sometimes is challenging.
Okay. We're just about at time. Maybe I can give you just a couple, a few seconds each, or a little bit longer to share some final thoughts. Anything you wanted to add or emphasize? It didn't come up.
We only barely touched on it, but I do think that one thing you'll see just really emphatically from the Trump administration and incoming AI czar, David Sachs, is a conversation around speech and AI, and we've alluded to that a little bit on the sort of communist side and the implications there. But I think you will see a lot of discussion, pressure, both commercial and governmental, about what are the techniques that are being used to shape the type of content that comes out of these mechanisms, and what impact does that have on speech in the US and around the world. I think that's an important challenge, and there's some good ways to approach this, and there's some much less good ways to approach this. And so I think that's going to be a really interesting issue.
Yeah, I think to sum it up, it's going to be an affirmative agenda, pro-innovation, pro-little tech. If you guys have seen a lot of the announcements, as Neil alluded to, or said explicitly, there is a very big elephant in the room, and that is the censorship of President Trump himself, of people who voted for him, of the base, at the hands of a lot of these big tech companies. So I think there's going to be a lot of effort to just ensure that, we have a First Amendment standard again, that there's no, the policing of American speech is not something that happens at scale anymore. And frankly, I am and I remain bullish on open source. We've seen it from people within the administration, because I think that thus far has proven to be the biggest hedge against the more censorious big tech companies. So we'll look for little tech to win the day.
Yeah, and one thing to be on the lookout for, too, is just the role of our states, especially if you're not from the U.S. Here. In the absence of a comprehensive AI measure at the federal level, I would not be surprised if we continue to see the trend of local governments, county governments, state governments picking up what they perceive to be a gap. I would disagree with that, but we've seen that happen this year. I think that's only going to happen next year, much of like what we saw happen with data privacy. I think that's a challenge, because there is a scenario that in a few years, perhaps, maybe not overnight, we could have 50 state AI measures that are all different and consistent. And that's already what we see playing out. Interestingly enough, even the states that have acted on the AI have essentially said, well, we're only acting because there's an absence of federal action, which honestly, I disagree with. There's no lack of federal action. We have federal laws in the books that can address AI, just not in a overarching manner, which some of the states have wanted. So do not rule out looking at state governments next year for sure.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. We're going to take a couple minutes to reset the stage, so if you want to go grab a coffee, but then please come back, because next is the fireside chat with Dr. Ben Buchanan. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. We also love to hear from you, so reach out at aipolicypodcast@csis.org with your suggestions and feedback. Finally, don't forget to visit our website, csis.org, for our latest research reports and events. This podcast was produced by Sarah Baker, Isaac Goldston, and Sadie McCullough. See you next time.